Okay now?
You ready for me now?
Okay. I'd like to welcome everybody to this talk by Lorenzo. I'm just going to give a wee bit of background information for people that have never seen or heard Lorenzo speak before. And it's just a basic outline of what he is all about. And then I'm just going to let him go into the talk. So basically, Lorenzo has been an activist since 1959. And amazingly, he started at the age of 12. He was involved in sit-in protests in Chattanooga that helped to end racial segregation at the time. Following that, he was drafted during the Vietnam War and spent 2 years in the army, where he became an anti-war activist at that time. And then following that, this is when he went in to join the Black Panther Party. And there's extensive references to Lorenzo's activist life if you wanted to Google it. I mean, there's lots of stuff and articles being published about him. But I think it's basically his talk this evening is about his thoughts in the here and now. And so I think we should just let open the meeting and let Lorenzo speak to us. And after that, we could have our question and answer session. So welcome, Lorenzo, and the floor's yours.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank my Scottish comrades for inviting me to speak. It was quite a surprise to, out of the blue almost, be getting such an invitation. I mean, I'm honored. And but I hadn't been to Scotland in over 20 years. And I guess whatever I said at the time, surprising to me, had a lasting impact. And for that, I'm extremely grateful. And that leads to the talk today. Well, I'm going to talk somewhat about my life, you know, my history of this. And but more importantly, I wanted to talk to you about you know, the radical approach that we need to take to austerity measures by our various governments and the collapse of capitalism. We need to talk about these things, which are extremely important. Now, in the United States, I mean, well, first of all, don't try to judge the United States by Scotland. It has a whole separate history. It's got a long history of racism, and it's hard to understand it unless you have thoroughly researched it or lived in the country. And but what I will tell you is that if you're talking about the capitalist system in the United States, the capitalist system was based on the enslavement and the system of chattel slavery of the African people. That's the first thing that you have to bear in mind. And since that time, you know, every analysis that we have to make that's going to be fruitful has to be with an understanding that the racist system or racism within the entire judicial, economic, social, and even the labor structure, all of that is affected by racism. And so, for a young black man, you know, in the 1960s, who came of age, and at the same time that the civil rights movement was erupting in the United States, we're talking about the, like I said, the late 50s and early 60s. I became involved with, at that time, the first movement was the youth movement of the National Association for Advancement of Colored People. And it was a very conservative, business-oriented organization, except for the youth wing. And the youth wing was the most hell-raising wing of all. We always challenged the adults, many of whom were extremely conservative, some of whom were in bed with the power structure. We always challenged them, and we always put pressure on them. Well, 1960, that was the year of the so-called sit-ins. This is the second phase of the civil rights movement I'm talking about. First phase was with Dr. King in Birmingham, Alabama, and that lasted, you know, late 50s up to 1960. 1960, a new movement came into existence of primarily black youth. They were not led by Dr. King. They were not led by the old line preachers and all these sorts of people. They were in fact led by the youth themselves, and they were community oriented. So their thing was they called for sit-ins. And if you heard of the Occupy movement, well, the sit-ins were basically the Occupy movement of its day, actually, and was far in advance of the Occupy movement that came out in the late 2000s. So we're talking about a kind of movement where the youth they realized that what they could do is to go into white places of business and disrupt them. Just sit in those places, demand that they be served food. And this was at a time of racial segregation. Black people weren't being served in so-called white restaurants. And there was a system of racial segregation which put it in law that black people had no rights that white people were bound to respect, and that you could be arrested, maybe even killed, for demanding basic human rights. And so this is the context that we're talking about. And these black youth had a demonstration in downtown Chattanooga in the department stores. There were 3 or 4 different department stores, major chains in the South, and they were practicing racial segregation. They just went along with the system. And so the students went in and demanded to be served. They wouldn't serve them, and they just sat there all day. And as long as they were there, the business owners couldn't make any money because the white people weren't going to come in and sit next to these blacks. In fact, they couldn't do it because black people occupied all the seats. And so this went on for quite some time. This went on for several days, and it disrupted the entire economic system of that city. But more importantly, it empowered the black community in a way that it never had been before. And so myself, when I was really young, I was about 11, 12 years old, marched from the sector where black people were restricted, in terms of segregated housing. We marched from our areas down to the center of town to, occupy the city center. And while we were coming, we were hit with high pressure water hoses. They threw tear gas bombs at us. They did all kinds of stuff. Now, you know about what happened in Birmingham, but most people don't know what happened in Chattanooga. And Chattanooga was even more dramatic than Birmingham because the people fought back. They weren't turning the other cheek. They weren't, laying there and allowing themselves to be beaten. They got up and started fighting. And they fought the Ku Klux Klan and racist white students inside of the department stores. And they also fought them in the streets. You know what I'm saying? I'm not physically fighting them. I'm not talking about turning the other cheek and praying for them. I'm talking about breaking the jaw. And they fought these racists to a standstill. And of course, the police came in huge numbers. The police and the sheriff's department from that area came in large numbers, and other local so-called law enforcement departments came to try to put down these what became an insurrection. And so they came down there, and then this stuff carried on for days. So they arrested this group of students, the first group of students, and they carried them off to jail. And no sooner had they done that, another group ran in and took their place. So they had to go through all this stuff again. And they had beaten the Klan and the white students to a pulp, to be quite honest. This was not expected to happen. Blacks are supposed to turn the other cheek or pray or whatever and allow themselves to be beaten. And they refused to do that. They refused to accept any indignities from these racists, and they beat them unmercifully. Unmercifully. It was something that the whites had never seen. And they were terrified, absolutely terrified. And they saw that they weren't going to be able to put down this movement with force of arms, with massive police numbers, bringing in the National Guard. They weren't going to be able to put it down with anything. And at the same time, these protests were going on in cities all over the South. I think some 60 cities were having these protests around this time in 1960. We're talking about in the early 1960s. And so this thing was building. It was powerful. It was building to an even larger crescendo. And we were able to force the cops and the city authorities to stop racial discrimination inside of these department stores, at least, and other aspects of daily life where black people were being subjected to racism. We were able to stop that as well over the course of time. Now, I'm not saying that we stopped all racism at all, I mean, every bit of racism, but we certainly defeated the power structure and the entity that was keeping it alive and in our face every day. And that's extremely important to understand that. It's like you know, when you deal with this, all the Southern culture and the Confederate monuments and all this garbage has been here for a long time in the South. And we were fighting it back then, trying to defeat it. And we did defeat many aspects of the segregation system, the system that was in place by law. Now, you might ask yourself, you know, well, what was the result of all this? Well, the result was, you know, black people who had been historically oppressed for hundreds of years finally rose up and demanded rights as a human being, and of course as a citizen of the United States and so forth. But the fact that the masses of people rose up, and when they did that, they pushed the state back so forcefully that the state had to grant concessions. They had to grant concessions. The state and the federal government. We're not just talking about state in terms of, you know, one of the southern states. There were like 16 southern states, but no, we're talking about the entire government. Because even though there was different kinds of segregation in the North, they in fact were being subjected to racial oppression. They were being forced into ghettos and what have you. So we're talking about a historical moment where black people rose up in numbers and fiercely fought back, something that had never happened before. And this protest movement lasted almost 20 years. You're talking about from, well, 57 to 77, you would be talking about. That protest movement lasted for a long time. That changed form at the later stages and so forth. And of course, the effect of COINTELPRO and all that and political assassination by the government has to be factored in. But the movement itself, which was based on the masses, not the leaders, it was based on the masses, that movement was able to advance rapidly, you know, in terms of what the politics was like, what the conditions for black people was like, and all of that. For me, I was never a leader. Let me make that point clear. I was always in the ranks of the organization, you know, and or the movement. And so after the first protest took place in Chattanooga, the massive protests, then I later got involved with protests around the city, continuing protests, but also got involved with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee sometime later. Now, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was probably the most militant wing of the actual civil rights movement. This is before the Black Panther Party, and I'll have to talk about that later. But this was the most militant wing. They believed in direct action, but they believed in at one stage, later on, he started believing in armed self-defense. They said that we can't stop the Klan and these racists from attacking us using purely pacifist means. We have to resort to whatever other human beings on the face of the earth have done, and that is to arm ourselves against white supremacy and violence. And that's what they did. But the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was an important organization. It was important in terms of the civil rights movement. It was an instrumental organization in creating the protests. Many of the protests that have been attributed to Dr. King and other organizations were by these students who had the energy and the time and who went into communities and talked to people and worked with people and lived among people, you know. And they were effective, extremely effective. In fact, they were so effective that they started to be assassinated by you know, police authorities in the South. And they started to be arrested en masse, and they started to be beaten and other forms of terror, you know, that they are employed. But it's still, with all of that, they were not able to stop us from doing what we needed to do in terms of organizing black people in the South in particular. They weren't able to do it. And so then the '63 March on Washington, which many people have been told about and claimed that all it was about was Dr. King's speeches and so forth and so on. And that was an important moment and everything, but that's what the media focused on. The organizers who actually created this thing, who called for it in the first place, was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And what happened is the government, the Kennedy administration, and the government, they turned around and tried to remove the student leadership and replaced it with these black preachers and these other organizations, adult organizations in the civil rights movement, that they knew were more pliable and compliant and not as militant. And so they were able to stifle that. And you know, John Lewis, you know, he just died and so forth. And they make out like he was such a wonderful person and this, that, and other. And in point of fact, he was a militant back then. He was a radical. He was calling for revolution in the South. He was calling for protests in the South, you know, massive protests. And he got that from SNCC, of course. But to stifle this event, the 63 March in Washington, the media took it over and they focused entirely on Dr. Martin Luther King's speech. And if you talk about it to this very day, most people will tell you all they remember was Dr. King's speech. And it was much more of it than that. And they took John Lewis and forbade him to speak until he changed the nature of his presentation. And they wanted him to not call for revolution. They wanted him to not denounce the federal government and his foot-dragging policies for so many years. And they wanted him to essentially just give up. And I won't say that he totally gave up, but I'll just tell you this. After the March on Washington, he had been the chair at that stage, the chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was defeated after that, and the whole process of organizing with SNCC changed after that, because they said, we've been sold out. Dr. King and the white labor unions and all the rest of them have destroyed our effort to organize this as a mass movement in the South. And so what they did over the course of time, and not much time, they removed John Lewis. First, he was defeated in his attempts to get reelected, and Stokely Carmichael took over. And I don't know whether people know it or not, but it was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that came forward with the ideas of Black Power. And in 1965, they weren't as developed as they would later become, but they took Lewis and pushed him out of the organization as a result of that. They felt like he had betrayed them. He had sold out to these conservative forces at the 1963 March on Washington, and other things that have never been disclosed very much in this period, except by people on the inside who knew about it. And so Stokely Carmichael took over, and it became progressively a more militant organization. It started attacking the police when they'd come down and beat black people in the street. They pushed the segregated cops out in the South, especially. They started practicing armed self-defense against the Ku Klux Klan and other fascist organizations, other racist organizations. Yeah. So in terms of this, this was a massive step from the early SNCC organization, which is just a youth organization, and it was working in the civil rights movement, but it was, you know, just part of the overall campaign. And Dr. King was in the ascendancy. But after that, they had changed their politics to go away from pacifism, to go away from you know, this whole idea that they can depend on the government, the federal government, to protect them and to give them their rights. They saw that was totally and patently a false assertion, a scam. And so they went away from that. And like I said, they started organizing in a new fashion in the South. Once they start organizing the poor people in the South into a mass movement, an independent mass movement, it would not be dependent upon the Democratic Party, which the Democratic Party then, now and then, subverted radical organizations, and they put them under the Democratic Party tutelage. And of course, they were under control after that happened. No matter what people tell you about it, if your organization or you are part of the Democratic Party process or the infrastructure, you've been sold out. You're selling out. You're selling out, to be quite honest. And this is that's what we were saying then. And we were fighting them from taking over SNCC as an organization, because there were elements that wanted to go and join the Democratic Party, wanted to get money from the Democrats, and and so forth and so on. You had that, and you know, and even today, there are organizations that you think are independent or you think that are militant. Like, to be quite honest, the Black Lives Matter is a Democratic Party front group now. And it's not the first one. It's not the only one. There are others in the black left. You know, the so-called Republic of New Africa folks. They're also in the Democratic Party fold. And so this is a form of subversion, actually. What it is, it's a way to kill the militancy in organizations and to have you adopt and accept the status quo. You know, adopt the so-called liberal left, as they call it in America. Well, I've never believed in that. I don't believe in that electoral politics anyway, never have. And I've seen that electoral politics is just a sellout, one, for radical forces to even do it, and two, it's not even effective. Most of the things, most of the rights that black people have won in America has been because of the ability and the willingness to get in the street and protest. That's it. You can't say Dr. King won anything. You can't say that any of the other so-called big four or big six leaders won anything. And in point of fact, if it wasn't for the people in the street, it wasn't for groups like SNCC, and later, of course, the Black Panther Party and all these other, but that's a different stage, then nothing ever would have been won. And so it's important to understand that. Now, if we looked at this period, the end of the end of the old civil rights movement, Black Power came into existence as a youth tendency, a spontaneous eruption against racism. Cities all over the country, black people rose up in rebellion against the white power structure and the so-called racial ghetto in the major cities. They rose up against that. And for years, they were out of control of the state. You had militant tendencies of all sorts that took on the cops, even killed cops. When the cops tried to invade the black community, you had people building all kinds of anti-authoritarian organizations, like, for instance, in Detroit, the workers in the automobile industry created an organization there in the various plants. And they were creating their own union because the AFL-CIO and UAW, the United Auto Workers, was so racist. So they started there to creating a black-led union, and a radical union. And well, it eventually was crushed, but before it was crushed, it left a legacy that showed you one black syndicalism, an example of black syndicalism that actually worked and actually was very effective. Probably other than in the earlier periods in the United States, when the IWW was doing things, the real IWW. I don't even consider what's around today as being the same thing. But anyway, despite that, they were able to build a movement. As I said, that was just one example. And all over the country, there were instances where black people took over school boards, took over the community. That's where community control, ideas of community control came from. And all this is going on. And of course, then there were these rebellions in Watts, California, in New Jersey, and Cleveland and other cities. These rebellions were extremely important as well. They may not have been something favored by the ruling class and the liberals, but it was the throwing off of the kind of yoke of oppression that had weighed heavily on us for so many years. So that's extremely important to understand. And Black Power was a diverse movement. To be quite honest, it was a movement that had one wing was a cultural studies group and poetry, and the other wing was a radical wing that included the Black Panther Party and other militant organizations that did organizing in the streets, fought racism, and fought the cops, and tried to transform society to be in a non-racist society. Now, the wing, when the Black Panther Party came into existence, it actually, the first thing it did was to unite with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Nobody likes to talk about this. It's supposed it didn't happen. There's all this other garbage you hear today. But in point of fact, this is what happened. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, its leaders were actually, what you want to call it, drafted into the Black Panther Party by Huey P. Newton. And this is made public. People know about this at this particular time. And also many important activists that were in SNCC. And it was an organization on the verge of breaking up. But many of those organizers, outstanding organizers, went into the Black Panther Party for, at the time, it was known as the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Now, that name only lasted a year when it went from being a militia to a political organization, political party. But the most important thing to understand in looking at a long swath of history, and I'm giving you a long swath of history, I'm not just talking to myself as an individual. I was a part of it, but I didn't run it. I was affected by it and organized in the midst of it. It's important to understand. I always tell people that. I'm not some leader. I didn't found this, that, and the other. And don't worship me. Don't worship me. I'm just an ordinary guy that was placed into extraordinary circumstances. That's all I am. I'm not any hero or this other stuff. And then we get to, as I said, the founding of the Black Panther Party when SNCC was dying out. But their leaders were drafted in first, and then different members in SNCC. Some of them joined, some joined, some of them didn't. I'm not going to claim that everybody joined in mass. That's not what happened. But some did join immediately or later on. It didn't matter. But in fact, one notable person is Fred Hampton. He came out of SNCC. So there are Chicago Black leader, I should say, Chicago Black Panther Party leader, Fred Hampton. He actually came out of SNCC. He had been in SNCC. At any rate, the Black Panther Party, which was founded in 1966, that's the year I got, shortly after I got out of the Army, around there. And but in 1966, the party was founded, and it opened up a new path for Black activism. One, it was not a civil rights organization, even though it respected the civil rights movement and some of the works that it had done, but it was not a pacifist organization, first of all, and it was not as I said, a civil rights group. Its objectives were socialists. They called themselves socialists, and their whole foundation was based on socialism. Now, as an anarchist, I look back at it, and it wasn't the kind of socialism that I am in favor of at this point in life. But at the time, it was a very radical organization because the civil rights movement practiced pacifism. They didn't practice pacifism. They practiced armed self-defense. They raised up the ideals of Malcolm X over Dr. King, even though they respected Dr. King. And they also said that they were revolutionaries, and their objective was not just to build a so-called black nation. They wanted to transform the United States. They wanted to turn the United States into a socialist country and to end capitalism completely. And so they came up with a 10-point program. And don't ask me to repeat the 10-point program. I don't. I'm 73 years old. I can barely remember what I ate yesterday. But don't. The more importantly than the program itself, which was instrumental for organizers and for the community to unite with, more importantly was that they were trying to radically transform the United States of America away from being a racist nation, away from being a capitalist nation, away from being an imperialist nation. They were trying to transform it. And then this was at a time when the Vietnam War was raging out of control. And so they were trying to even organize black GIs, and SNCC had been the one who started this organizing black GIs from GIs being soldiers, black GIs from fighting in the Vietnam War. They wanted them to drop out, and many did, you know, but it wasn't easy to do, and it also was something that was punishable by the authorities, by the higher level staff. And so we had to organize for it. I started doing this, in fact, when I was in the Army. I started, we were in Germany. The President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, had said that he was going to expand upon the Vietnam War, bring in more troops, and increase the level of the the invasion. That's what it really was, the invasion. He was going to increase the war effort. And so he wanted to bring in another 500,000 or 600,000 troops. And he wanted to, instead of dealing with the hassle, as he saw it, of the draft, where the anti-war movement was all over him. You know, the anti-war movement was extremely powerful in anti-draft resistance. So to get around that, what he decided he was going to do was to take all of the soldiers that he already had, and you know, the United States occupies, well, now they got 900 bases in foreign countries, and but he wanted to take the troops out of France, where they originally were there for a while, to that point, and out of Germany, where I was, and there was a large number of troops there, and as many as 100,000. And he also wanted to take troops out of, you know, other countries that had been there since World War II. And he wanted to take those troops in large numbers, and them and others they could get, either through the draft or whatever. And then they would send them, well, from South Korea as well. And they would send those troops to Vietnam. And they'd be the fresh expeditionary troops that they felt could turn the battle into their behalf, their way. And what they didn't count on was that the troops themselves, the soldiers would have something to say about this. We would resist. And that's what we did. Well, first of all, there was an organization created called the American Servicemen's Union. And it sprang up and it spread all over the world, especially all over the places where, you know, there were military troops, American military troops. And they devised a plan to resist. And I was one of those in Germany. I was in Germany. I was one of those that came aboard to figure out a plan to fight this. And so we started a campaign of getting troops to desert the army and go to a third country. And in our instance, in Europe, the third country I think was well, there were a number of them. There was Sweden, Switzerland, and Norway. I think it was Norway as well. And they were taking in American soldiers and giving them political asylum. And so I was organizing it. I was one of those organizing. I'm not telling you I'm the only one who's doing it. No, I'm not. There were others as well in various parts of Germany and France and other places that were doing the same thing. Well, I was in Mannheim, Germany, which was where one of the major concentration camps were located that the Hitler regime had. And that was also the same building was where the American government had its troops, its stockade, or its military prison. And so we were organizing, we were getting people out of the country and so forth. And in my case, I organized this stuff for about a year. I did it for about a year, maybe. And then they came down on me. The military police arrested me, or tried to arrest me one night at a social club where all the GIs were. They tried to come and get me, and it started a riot. They beat the MPs up and took their guns and everything else and ran them up out of there. And so they had come and get me at another time in another place. And they did. I was in another location, and I always have considered that I was set up to be in this location, you know, by my commanders at the base where I was located. But at any rate, they sent me to this place, and the military police came. They assaulted me, beat me up, knocked the tooth out and everything. Just just literally beating me because I had resisted when they tried to take me before, and some of them got all beat up and all that stuff. And so they were going to get their revenge. So they beat me up and they threw me in the military jeep, and they drove me to this stockade or this military prison. And I stayed there for quite some time. Then I got out when the charges, they were trying to give me a treason charge, which would have put me in prison forever, or had me executed. Although they claimed they weren't doing that back then. That's a lie. They did execute people. They were hanging. But at any rate, I was there, and I got out of that facility when the German anti-war movement and these radical Chiis, these soldiers, got together, and they got an attorney. They hired an attorney, and they started having demonstrations at the base, which was unheard of. Unheard of that someone would have a demonstration at a military base, but they started doing it. And it unnerved the officials. And whereas they would have unmercifully dealt with me, I don't know, I could have at least gotten life, double life in prison, or could have been even sentenced to death. I don't know for sure, but I'm just telling you what the deal was at that particular time in history. I was able to get out eventually after the trial. They held the trial, and the judge said he had the intention of trying to give me life in prison or the death penalty. And he said that he reassessed this because there was such an uproar in Germany and parts of Europe after I'd been captured and after they put me on trial. So I was able to get out of this stuff. They gave me a pretty lenient sentence. I think I'd almost done all of it within a year's time. And they got me out, and then they shipped me back to the United States. And eventually I got out of the military, came home. And when I came home, I became active in the anti-war movement. As I said, I was at SNCC had its focus on the Vietnam War, and especially the large number of blacks going into the military and serving as cannon fodder. So I got involved with that. And then when the Black Panther Party came along, I started, and they sent their newspapers to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So I got their newspapers and started selling them in Chattanooga. And that caused me a great deal of harm. The police would stop me and push me around, might beat me up or whatever, and seize the papers and destroy them, that sort of thing. And this went on for quite some time. And eventually, it got worse. Of course, in 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in Tennessee, in Memphis, Tennessee. Well, excuse me. He was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, which 1968. And what you don't know is that a massive rebellion broke out in all the cities in Tennessee. And as a result of that rebellion breaking out, the authorities, the governor and the others, tried SNCC and the Black Panther Party. They didn't know very much about the Black Panther Party then. It was a new organization, but they tried them for treason. They tried them for treason. Of course, this is 1968. And they started a so-called Black Power grand jury that was going on all over the state to investigate the SNCC and the Black Panther Party, and investigating the rebellions themselves as being part of some. Everything back then was a communist conspiracy. It's a communist conspiracy. These blacks don't have the sense enough to rise up like this. They had to be trained. Excuse me. Well, they were trying to get me to come to the grand jury. They were trying to arrest me. And I was told by a cop that I went to school with He said, man, I'm going to tell you this, and you didn't get this from me. He said, but these people don't intend, if they arrest you, they don't intend for you to come out of jail alive. I'm going to tell you like it is. And he told me that, and I took it to heart, and made arrangements to get out of the city, which I did. And but the FBI, you know, its reach was all across the country, and it started an investigation and started looking for me. And so I had to leave the country. And the quickest way to leave the country back in that day was to hijack a plane to Cuba. And that is what I did. I hijacked a plane to Cuba. I asked for political asylum. Well, that's a story in and of itself. I didn't necessarily receive political asylum, to be quite honest. There was a problem with the Cuban government and the Black Panther Party at the time. Some people say it was caused by Eldridge Cleaver and his antics and so forth when he was in Cuba. I don't know that for a fact, but I have to give some credence to it because I saw things when I was there. And but at any rate, I was in jail there in Cuba for a brief period of time. And then I was shipped out of the country and sent to Czechoslovakia. Now, I don't know why I was sent to Czechoslovakia. And this was right after the Russians had invaded the country, the Warsaw Pact, which doesn't exist today, is a military pact. They had invaded the country and, you know, and put it under occupation. So I was there at that time. And somehow the American authorities, well, they had, first of all, they had an embassy there in Czechoslovakia, in Prague, which is kind of surprising, really, because of that was during the time of the so-called Cold War between the United States and Russia. And, but at any rate, they had an embassy there. And they sent some people out looking for me, and they captured me and took me into the embassy. And they were going to, you know, just arrest me and take me back to the United States right then, no questions asked. And instead, what happened, I got a chance to escape, a break, and I went for it, and I got away, and went on the run. And I was on the run for maybe a month or so, and then I went some really weird places, some interesting places. I went at first. There was a group of so-called gypsies or Roma people, and I saw them there. And when I was getting off the train after I got out of Prague, and I saw them at the train station, and I don't know why, I just walked up and started talking to them. And of course, they didn't know what I was saying, but they didn't speak English, except for one person. One person spoke English, and somehow I was able to tell him that I was in trouble, I needed help, I considered them brothers and sisters and so forth and so on, and asked for help. And they took me to a so-called gypsy camp, as they call it. In England, they call them travelers. But in the United States, they call them gypsies, but they're Roma people. And they have a historical experience that's very similar to the oppression of blacks. They, in fact, were they were chattel slaves on plantations in Eastern Europe, in Romania, and other countries as well. And they've never had their rights, just like black people haven't had their rights. They may not be slaves right now, but they were slaves for hundreds of years. And so we started talking, me and this one person who could speak English. And he said, I'm going to take you to a place they'll never find you, you know. And so I went with the Roma people into a so-called gypsy camp, you know, which is really just, in this day, and, you know, in the later stages of life, they put them in what essentially are estates council or some kind of projects. That's what they were. Anyway, they lived in these ghettos, you know, like black people lived in ghettos in the United States, and they kept me there. And for a good period of time, I hid out there, and the police never came there. One reason they didn't come there is because it was like an outlaw zone, a no-go area, and the police would come there and they would fight them like hell, you know. They might shoot at them. Anything. They had rebellions. They had all kind of stuff going on in that area. So it was a no-go zone for the police, and it was a great place for me to hide out. And I hid out there for quite a while. But eventually, I was supposed to have. There were some African students in Czechoslovakia that I'd met, and they had made arrangements for me to go to Africa for asylum. And I attempted to do that, and I left, which you could say was a mistake. But I couldn't stay forever with the gypsies as much as I wanted to. I'm not going to call them gypsies. That's disrespectful. With the Roma people. I stayed there for quite some time. And then I left, and that was a stupid mistake on my part. I shouldn't have left. I'd probably still be on the run, but I'd have been free all those years. And, you can't go back and repeat history, though. At any rate, after I left them and went on my way to East Germany, to Berlin, I got there, stayed with the students for a brief period of time, and then was recaptured by security agents of, this wasn't the CIA, it was something called the Bureau of National Research, which used to be, I don't even know if it still exists today, but at any rate, what I'm saying, it was part of the State Department. It was a security wing of the State Department. And these are the people who trained the secret police in Iran under the Shah. They trained the secret police in South Vietnam and used them against the people. And they were involved with all kinds of skullduggery in the world, and hardly anyone knew about them. They were a super secret agency, and somehow they wound up coming after me. They grabbed me. They didn't say, "Well, you're under arrest," so and so. They just grabbed me. They stabbed a needle in my arm, and a needle with some sort of fluid, and knocked me out, and just drugged me out into a car. And I didn't wake up till I was in so-called West Berlin. And I was kept there for some time and tortured for information and all kind of stuff. Eventually, the FBI started demanding that they bring me back to the United States, and that's what happened. So I came back to the United States, got 2 life sentences in a short period of time. Of course, let me just say this, in between the time they got and brought me back to the United States, I was put in the federal house of detention in New York. I met Martin Austerity, which was one of the main activist prisoners in the world, probably the best known political prisoner in the world at that time. And he talked with me every day while I was in that facility. And he drummed anarchism into my brain, as a political alternative. And he was really concerned about me because I was facing the death penalty. And he tried to help me, in terms of my case and so forth. But the discussions we had there changed my life. The discussions I had with Martin Austerity. First, he was a heavy intellectual, but he wasn't a writer. Otherwise, more people would know about him. Actually, he was an organizer, leader, and an intellectual. And he taught me a lot of stuff. He taught me really the foundations of anarchism and the foundations, particularly of so-called black anarchism, or what I call the black autonomy. And so I met with him, and then I left there and went to Georgia. And like I said, in Georgia, I was given 2 life sentences by an all-white jury, a Klan jury, in a Klan area. I wasn't tried in Atlanta, which has a majority black population. I was tried in a racist hellhole. Even the marshals told me this. They took me down there. So that's a racist hellhole, a Klan hovel, and I didn't have a chance, I was, and I could have been sentenced to death, but the judge, who was a hanging judge, had a reputation as a hanging judge, said, if I sentence this man to death, all these white liberals and Jews and all the rest of them would be coming down here, and these civil rights Negroes and all the rest of them be coming down to this county trying to save him. So I'm going to sentence him to natural life in prison without any possibility of parole. And he'll die in prison. That's what he said. And so they took me out, and I came to the prison system. And for 15 years, I served 15 years in prison. I could have served all of my time in prison, But I had an outside defense organization, the Anarchist Black Cross and others, was able to lead a worldwide campaign on my behalf. Also inside the United States, there were groups that I had worked with and so forth that supported me. And we were able to put enough pressure on the government eventually over the course of time that, one, they did away with the law that said that, you could be sentenced to death. You could be sentenced to death for, hijacking a plane, wherever, to Cuba, anywhere else. You could be sent, they did away with that law. It was ruled unconstitutional. And then also my sentence, they had to reduce my sentence so I could receive a trial. They didn't reduce the life portion of it. What they just did is that instead of me having to waiting, not having a chance of parole, they gave me the opportunity that I would effectively be eligible for parole immediately. And so I got out, and as I said, I came back home to Tennessee and started working in Tennessee against the Klan and the cops, and which was really a serious issue there. The police had killed, at that time when we talk about in 1983, the city of Chattanooga had the largest number of police killings in the country for any city under 200,000 people. And that comes from the Department of Justice. That's not my opinion. And so we organized. When I got there, I met two black women, and these two black women were friends, and one of them, father, had been murdered in the city jail, beaten to death and choked. And so we started a campaign around that, but then the campaign eventually spread to other cases of people who've been murdered there over the years, over a long period of time. Ku Klux Klan cops, but I'm saying that, I'm not saying that as a some sort of slogan. I'm saying Ku Klux Klan cops were in the city police department, and they were doing these things, these killings, and they had impunity, just like they do today, really, impunity against these murders. And so we started this campaign, and for 15 years we waged a campaign against police terrorism, And although Chattanooga is a small city of about 175,000, 200,000 people, it was jumping. It was hot. It was had the most protests of any city in the South at that time. People were coming from other cities, bigger cities, Atlanta, Nashville, even Memphis, were coming to Chattanooga because we had that city rocking. We were fighting. We were resisting the Klan by any means necessary, resisting the cops by any means necessary, and we were winning. Which is more important. And then we had this massive demonstration. I think that was in 1987 against the Klan, and we filed a lawsuit also. That was a year that a lot of things happened that was favorable to us. And so in 1990, we won the case against the city government, which was a Klan. You know what? There had been no black people in the government in Chattanooga, Tennessee, since 1912. And so it was like a 90-year period when we filed this lawsuit. We won this lawsuit. And so they, eventually had to allow blacks to run for office and so forth and so on, and had to allow blacks to vote and all this kind of thing. And we're talking about 1990, and they didn't really have the right to vote, And so white supremacy has always been a serious problem, and it still is a serious problem there, even though they claim it's a new South and all this sort of propaganda. It is a racist place today, and you can go in there and you can get killed, today. So realizing that, when I organized, the last thing I did in that city, I was organizing over the deaths of two black men, got charged, and myself and three other members of Black Autonomy, which is a group I founded, years ago, 1994, I think. That was the first black anarchist collective in the United States. May have been in the world, but certainly in the United States. And it's interesting that to this very day, there's now a series of new black anarchist organizations that have been founded. And of course, I have no doubt, you know, I'm not saying this to pat myself on the back, but I have no doubt that it was because of, sorry, it was because of the work that myself and others in the Black Autonomy Federation did that resulted in this this new upsurge of blacks. They read the book. They had the book was accessible to read. The work we did and the contradictions we raised and our battles against the ruling class and all of that. Those things have inspired a new generation. I don't like to look at it this way. But somebody said, "Well, you're the father of the Black anarchist movement," and I said, "Well, now I don't know about all of that." But to some extent, it may be true. I don't know. And if it is, so what? The main thing is that new movements on the scene today. I feel there's a responsibility myself to try to, if they reach out to me, and they have, to help them come to fruition and even go way past what we did. I think that's important. Okay, so I guess you could look at me and look at my background and say it's a radical background. True enough. But the things we organize against and still do organize against, say for instance, austerity in the United States. And austerity in the United States is racialized like everything else. The amount of poverty, the highest level of poverty in the United States are black and maybe brown people. Latinx, they call them now. You know, then the indigenous people as well, you know, the so-called Indians, what they used to call them. They also are still trapped on the reservation. These are economic prisons. The ghetto, the barrio, the Indian reservation are all the same basic means of controlling peoples of color in the United States. And now we each have a separate history in relation to the United States government, what became the United States government. And to this very day, people are poor and starving on reservations, poor and starving in black ghettos, poor and starving in barrios. And this is as a result of this system, the way it was constructed based on the labor, the land, and the resources of the peoples of color who were here. Those who came as slaves, like my ancestors, those indigenous people who were in the in the country, and who had to fight a war of survival against the United States government and its expeditionary troops, and the the lands that were stolen from Mexico, and the people that were stolen from Mexico. All of this has to be factored into an understanding of the United States as a system and as an economy. Has to be factored in. So what you've had in the United States, you know, years have gone by. We know you've had socialist tendencies and all that, and radical groups, but they've all been white. They haven't in any way touched the existence of black people for the most part, or you know, other peoples of color, other oppressed peoples of color. They haven't touched it. And so, for the most part, you find that the movements that have come into existence with black people and other peoples of color are with black leaders, black organizers, and black organizations. Now, that doesn't mean to say that they're unwilling to work with other peoples. Doesn't mean that. But the predicament and the level of oppression and poverty among peoples of color far exceeds what happens to whites. Now, there are white people who are very poor. Don't get me wrong. There are some in Appalachia, for sure, and other places. But the type of structure that oppresses black people and other peoples of color is different. It's different. And when white people can get money and get jobs and so forth, black people can't, for the most part. And it's only when we have fought for these basic rights or the same ability to be treated equally. It's only when we're willing to do that we get anything whatsoever. But we're looking now, we're at a new stage now, and I'm going to detract a lot of the time frame from my personal story. You know, I'm going to just detract from that to talk about the issue of poverty and oppression under the capitalist system right now in the United States. I can't talk about the entire world. I haven't lived everywhere. But I wanted to talk about the United States because the United States is going to cause, and is causing, a depression, another depression. Just like the United States caused the 1930s, 1929 depression. The United States caused that, you know, the economy and the Wall Street, the collapse of Wall Street. And we're seeing similar things today, although it's being brought on by the coronavirus and so forth. Nevertheless, it is crippling the economy of the United States and crippling even the political structure. It's creating contradictions where people will have to fight to survive. You know, right now, the last time I checked, there were 61.9 million people who have had to apply for unemployment. 61.9 million. That far exceeds the Great Depression itself. And they're getting nothing from the government. I mean, I know it's Trump and all that, but they're getting nothing from the government, period. And he's trying to even cut the social programs that already exist. So whatever movement comes into existence now to fight this, and it hasn't come in yet, but whatever movement comes into existence, there's got to be a movement that understands how race and class intersect. You know, how they intersect, and how you can't build a movement strictly talking about, you know, this thing about a term that's being used a lot. They only call it fascism when it happens to white people. And what that term really means is that blacks and other peoples of color are being oppressed every day, subjected to police killings, subjected to starvation, subjected to genocide, partial or otherwise. And they don't call that fascism. They don't call it, they don't say that the state is an entity that sustains fascism. Now, so black people, and especially the Black Panther Party when it came into existence, and I'm not going to go into a whole lot of the things about the party in terms of just romanticism. I'm going to talk about the historical significance of one program that they created, and it was what essentially now is being called Black anti-fascism. Back in the day, it was something else. But this movement, the party itself, was a living embodiment of an anti-fascist movement. When we know that they did engage in armed self-defense against the fascist organizations, street-level organizations, they call them now, but they engaged in combat against them, and they wiped them out whenever they came in contact with them or beat them back. In addition to that, they organized communities to be able to resist without their organization being a part, which is really something. And they also had a conference in 1968, I think it was, the United Front Against Fascism. And there they were trying to get a movement around their predicament in terms of the government wiping them out with the counterinsurgency or counterintelligence program. And they also built this organization because they wanted to raise the level of consciousness and organizing against police terrorism, against racism and all the exploitation that happens in black communities. And at that time, there were popular movements among whites as well, and the Black Panther Party was very popular. So when that conference took place, the majority of participants were actually white. And of course, this startled and scared the living bejesus out of the FBI. They wanted to know how in the hell this happened. And of course, there were other elements that criticized the Black Panther Party for doing that or having that develop. Well, look at this. That initial group, which many of which didn't stay with it, but it laid the foundation of another anti-fascist movement, the National Committee to Combat Fascism. And that organization lasted longer, and it was effective in one of the things it did do. It raised the level of consciousness to such an extent that in instances where the police might have raided a Black Panther Party office, and there were a number of those, masses of people will walk around and cover the building so that the police couldn't just rush in and kill all the people inside, or arrest all the people inside, whichever the case may be. More importantly, they turn the community against the police. The whole idea of there being a police. Why should there be a police in a Black community, or in any community for that matter? Who does the police represent? And it certainly is a truth that it does not represent the people. They don't protect and serve Black and brown and other communities, even poor white communities. They don't do it. They don't exist to do it. They exist to control those communities with massive police force if they have to. And that's what we're seeing today. We're saying that what we're seeing today with the police is that they have impunity, and they have been given military implements. And so they are using that to just kill people at random, kill Black people, particularly at random, for anything. Many of these cases that have been shown is just somebody that, they grab on the street. They grabbed and choked a number of people to death like that on the street. And this has been going on for many, many years. And if we take their figures as to how many people die each year in the United States from police terror, then we have to say that, in point of fact, this is warfare. This is what class warfare looks like. This is what police terrorism looks like. And this is why you can't reform the police. Now, I'm one of the few saying that. I'm going to be quite honest with you. I'm one of the few in the United States saying that. But anyway, so we have to look at all this stuff that's happening today in the context of the capitalist system being in trouble, resorting to police state techniques, resorting to corporate fascism. That's what Trump represents. He represents corporate fascism. Now, he doesn't have the intelligence to run everything himself, but he is in position that those around him and those financing him that you don't even see, or that they are benefiting from his being in office. And if he can get his second term in, it'll be much more dangerous for people who look like me or other people, in fact, activists, people in the streets that are fighting police terror. All these people he wants to eliminate, destroy with police terror and with military tactics. That's what he wants to do. He wants to take away any right to have legal protests or any protests. He wants to, in fact, make every protest illegal and a crime. And he wants to have total control under a personal dictatorship. That's what he wants. That's what's happening right now. People find it hard to believe these things are happening. Oh my goodness, what's going on? Well, what's going on is something you could have predicted 2-3 years ago. He's consolidating his rule. He's adopting more harsh measures, and if he can get back in or hold on to power by hook or crook, he will even be more dangerous. Then we can talk about all kinds of stuff happening. But it isn't just Trump. The entire system is bankrupt, and the entire system is corrupt. Whether he gets elected or not, reelected or not, the other guy coming in behind him, he's a crook too, and he may be a politician with a different style, but he certainly has the same objectives to keep this system alive and lord it over the people. Anyway, I don't know what else I'm supposed to say here. I hope I said something that made any sense whatsoever. And I will tell you that I was tremendously appreciative of the call to come in here and say what I did have to say. I'm a black activist, and I don't apologize for that. But what I will say is I'm a class conscious revolutionary, and I understand in order to ultimately defeat the system, we will have to unite all forces that we can unite. No problem there. But poor black people who have leadership potential in their own movements and so forth, and who really have a different kind of movement, versus in the United States, Antifa, who is a group I criticize all the time because they think that the greatest danger of fascism comes from the street forces of the fascist movement, the various tendencies, where they come and go. They think that that's the biggest threat. And especially now, we have to say that the biggest threat of fascism is the state. It's the state that creates the fascist regime, the state and capital. And we should be fighting the state. I mean, I'm not saying that the forces in the street we should just ignore them, but we got to understand that Trump controls those people. He proved that the other night at a so-called debate. He controls the Proud Boys and all these other fascist tendencies. He came into office with a collective of groups and movements, all extreme right movements. He came into office with them. It's not just him calling the shots. He may be the face, he may be the buffoon, but in point of fact, there are elements within the state and the capitalist system that get some benefit out of him, where they would have gotten rid of him a long time ago. So that's what I can say. I hope it made sense. I wanted to give you my perspective at least. Austerity is linked intrinsically to capitalism and the state. We have to understand that. We have to fight it. We can't take the posture that because these are government programs or something or other that people have been surviving on, we can just overlook them and don't overlook anything. You can't create, unless you can create an alternative, then don't tell people not to receive government programs that many of times that they fought for, over the years. Poor people and black people in the welfare rights organization, which was one of the major anti-poverty and anti-poor organizations in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s. Independent, run by black women who were the recipients of so-called welfare programs. And they fought tooth and nail against attempts to destroy these programs. Now, they ultimately were destroyed by a so-called liberal. And sadly, because of racism in the United States and opportunism, these black women didn't have the strong support they should have had from the labor unions and from other forces in the civil rights movement and so forth. And this was because of class snobbery against these black poor women who didn't have the pedigree that these elements from the black colleges or the establishment had. But anyway, I hope I said something here tonight that made some sense. I'm not a college professor, by the way. I've never lectured to college. Well, I'm not asking me a lie. I've never lectured at college. I've been called in to lecture, but I'm not a college professor, an academic. I've always been a grassroots organizer, a revolutionary grassroots organizer, but a grassroots organizer. That's all it's ever been. You know what I'm saying? And so, and I take pride in that. that I haven't sold out, that I haven't sought some kind of entry or entree to the middle class or to the upper crust. I haven't sought that. I haven't sold out to that. So that's been me. That's been my life, the part of it I want to talk about, and that's been the things I wanted to talk about. And as I said, I hope you got something out of it, and you can ask me questions. Thank you.
Come on.
Good to see you too.
There's plenty of food for thought. Maybe people could think about a few questions coming from their position and their experience in anti-austerity movements here. Andy, is your vocals working? I'm just.
I'm fine, aye. Unmuted. I'm fine.
We've got a question from Gahan Lorenzo. They've asked, could you say something about the survival pending revolution programs and their relevance to austerity?
Yeah, I can say something about that. These programs were designed to deal with poverty in the United States. That's why I told you austerity, long-term austerity, is in fact policy decisions by the state and the structure of the economy. And so the Black Panther Party in 1966, well, 67, I'll say, created the survival programs, and there were. I'm not an expert on it. My wife is much better than I am, but in talking about these, but there were 38 such programs, and I can't tell you what every program was, but I'll just say, you know, of course, you know about the free breakfast for children program, and there was you know, free housing, free food, and free shoes, and free some of everything, you know. And eventually, and this is over the course of time now, we're not talking about all at one time, it was created. There was a free medical service program. In fact, the Black Panther Party came up with the method to cure sickle cell anemia. And it's something to think about. You know, a small organization of 5,000 members came up with first a tracking method, and a cure for sickle cell anemia that was endangering the lives of millions of Black people, and even some other people from the Mediterranean, as I understand as well. But they were threatening; it was threatening their lives, and they were dying at the age of 35. You know, and people were terrified that they would die young, and the party got involved with it. Now you got to understand that mainstream medicine didn't know about or didn't care about the program. It was considered to be a Black disease. Well, let them die. We hate them anyway. And so the party started dealing with it, and they started coming up with a cure. And then there were other black doctors and black doctors associations that united with them, and they came up with effectively a cure for sickle cell anemia that the medical establishment didn't care about, didn't know about, and didn't know how to treat. They came up with it. Black people came up with a solution, and especially the Black Panther Party. And the Black Panther Party, out of this, created a nationwide medical program and had facilities to treat people in 13 cities. And, you know, this was just unheard of. A group with no money hardly at all, and you know, without any trained medical doctors, but a few, you know, and volunteers were able to come up with a you know, a national program first to detect the disease, and then to come up with something to have a line of treating it. People did that themselves. They didn't require the government to do it, and it's an extremely important example. Now, as I said, it was 38 programs. I don't know them all, but they dealt with every aspect of life. You know, to try to take people off the streets, to try to give people food to eat. There were, you know, people used to have the party used to have in cities all over the country free grocery giveaway, free food giveaway. And they would give away bags to hundreds of people, whoever came, however many came. They would give bags of groceries to them, and also would give them political education. Of course, they, you know, they had to hear about how they got in this predicament of being impoverished, how they got in this situation where they didn't have food, how food is controlled by the rich and the corporations and so forth. They explained all this stuff to them, and so they got food of two different types. They got the physical nourishment, and they got the political nourishment of the brain. So, and this happened for a long period of time, my friends, you know, a long time, years. And the Black Panther Party, I was just talking to my wife about it last night. She said that it lasted from 1966 to 1982, because the last program was the Oakland school. I can't remember. Oakland Community School, I'm sorry. That was the last program that died out. And so they were an effective organization, and they had reached a lot of people in this country. They became a major presence in the United States. They weren't only one, of course. You know, there was a time when all kinds of black organizations existed, including black militant organizations. But they were, although they were part of the, you know, essentially part of the Black Power movement, although many people don't like that. They don't like the identification, but they nevertheless came up with these programs, and these programs lasted until they disbanded the national campaigns, the national chapters. Until they did that, those campaigns were in existence and really effective. Hope that answers. Was there any one in particular you were interested in?
They've not come back with an answer to your question, Lorenzo, so I'll just move on to the next question if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Oh, catch my place. So the next question is from Michael. He says he saw that a young black girl nailing the black prosecutor who let the cop killers of Breonna Taylor off. The voice of revolutionary youth publicly unmasked, and he asks how far advanced is the movement in recognising the reactionary role of black opportunism, and how is it being challenged?
You know, it's kind of interesting that in the three states that you know, that at least the three have gotten all this publicity, George Floyd in Minnesota, you know, the man was shot in Kenosha, and and of course in Louisville. All of them are black prosecutors. You know, some people believe that the fact of black prosecutors or black cops or whatever, that makes a difference in how the so-called justice system is conducted. And these people are just fronts. They are fronts, agents for the same racist authority that existed before they got in office. And it's going to be that way until this system itself is overthrown. So these black faces in high places have no value whatsoever. And so, of course, I'm talking about in terms of the government. You mentioned about the police shooting and so forth, and the district attorney. No, these people are part of the problem. They're part of the system. You should make no mistake about that. Now, everyone doesn't recognize it, but I think a large section of the black community does recognize it. And I also think that tragic events like this educates large numbers of black people, particularly, so they will not have the faith or the misplaced faith in the government and the state, thinking that somehow they're going to protect their rights or they're going to give them justice.
Just to say, folks, if you raise your hand in the participant window, we will, and you want to ask Lorenzo directly, you can, rather than having me read it out to him. I'm sure you're all sick of hearing me already. But in the meantime, I'll move on to the next question from Beth. And Beth says, Lorenzo mentioned that the original Black Lives Matter group became a front for the Democrats. And she asks, where does he see the latest wave of the Black Lives Matter movement going in the future?
You know, after a time, the thing that, you know, you get older and you supposedly get wiser, and so you're in a position where you can see through the con, you can see through the tricks that the state uses, right? And one of the things that they do is they create movements for you. And they'll create these movements. They know in advance that these movements are not going to fundamentally challenge the capitalist state itself. They may talk about ending state violence and all that, but they're not talking about ending the state or ending the financial sector that supports them. So it's important to understand that. I'm not making something that is just an overt attack on a group or whatever. I look at movements to the core of them. What do they represent and who do they represent? And what kind of leadership do they have? What kind of organization do they have? And the fact of protests alone, we need to go beyond protests. We need to go to the point of reconstructing this entire society. We need to end the system of capitalism. Because as long as you have capitalism, you will have police. That's just a fundamental fact. And we're not teaching people this. And I think this is one of the failures of these kind of movements. They come along at a particular point in time, you know, and make, you know, and I consider making the noise about it, but they're not fundamentally changing the system. They want to take and defund it, as they say. But what does that really mean in the final analysis? You know, the same racist cops and the unions are going to be in a position to fundamentally run things. In fact, we're in a dangerous stage now that the cops have come to the conclusion that what they need to do is to take the power from the politicians and have it where the police unions, especially, and that's who saves these cops when they get charged with a crime or whatever. They want to be able to have it so that the police unions run the city police. And that would be a very dangerous situation. Then you talk about even more police killings. You talk about an outright death squad, that the police would be an outright death squad if they are not already. But they'd have essentially political control that the mayor and the city council and all them have now, and the cops could just decide to do anything they wanted to and not have any repercussions. Not that they're having very many anyway. But I don't think that we've reached the stage yet. See, the difference, somebody tried to say that the Black Lives Matter is like the Black Panther Party for this generation. No, it's not. Black Panther Party was a revolutionary organization. They advocated for socialism. They believed in armed self-defense, and they weren't in bed with the state, you know, like many of these organizations are. I talked to you about how certain left forces are captured by the Democratic Party, particularly. They're captured by the Democratic Party. And they're never the same kind of group after that. They essentially have sworn off on the goal of destroying capitalism. And instead, they are looking for an avenue to be empowered within the state, to be a capitalist caretaker.
Our next question's from Becca. They say, hi Lorenzo, I'm a bit camera shy, but I was really moved to hear you speak. I've recently read Natives, Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire by Akala. And the whole book makes the link between racism and class divides in the UK and how the two relate. I've not had any experience of actively protesting, but I do feel like education alone isn't enough in times like this, especially given the state being hell-bent on their reign of austerity in the UK. What advice do you have for anyone young and angry who wants to make a difference and actually be heard?
Well, I will say that if you want to be heard, you got to get out in the streets. You don't necessarily have to have the same program somebody else has got, but you got to get out in the streets. That much is for sure. I have a terminology I've been using quite a lot lately called become ungovernable. We have to become ungovernable to the state so that the state does not control our lives, does not control our communities. And to do that, we need to start building a revolutionary presence in this period right now. And we shouldn't give any credence whatsoever to either of the political parties, whether it's in the United States, the Republicans and the Democrats. And you should read the criticism of Malcolm X, what he made about the Republicans and the Democrats. It's one of the best criticisms I've ever seen. He used a very few number of words to do it. He didn't take a whole book. And they have the same goals. And so if we're going to build anything, we can't depend on these political parties, whether they're in the UK or the United States. They really represent the same thing, and that is the rich. Let's be quite clear about that. And it's going to become more and more apparent just to what extent the police and these other institutions really represent the rich, because the rich are going to be, they are getting very antsy. They think they're on the verge of being toppled, and so they're ready to go to fascism. You know, they're ready to use fascism. There's a split in the United States right now between the use of outright fascism with the Republicans and the forces behind the Republicans, the money men and the bankers and all these other institutions, Wall Street and all these. So there's a split in the ruling class, and that split is being reflected in the so-called election. And although neither one of the forces in the election is going to result in any kind of drastic or revolutionary or radical change, either one of them is, but it has riled up masses of people who get behind this garbage, get behind this corrupt electoral system. I don't believe in the electoral system. I don't tell people that they should not vote and all that because it was a right fought for. I just tell them that they're not going to get free under the electoral system. I have a saying I use it called "Vote for me and I'll set you free." And what it really means, it was a piece of a song by the Temptations back in the day. What it really means is that the cynicism of the idea that you're going to vote for this guy and he's going to set you free or he's going to do this and that. That's essentially what the whole campaign of this guy Biden is. That's his whole spiel. And he's not the first one. There's been others, these so-called liberal politicians and all that. They don't represent anything. If we're going to get anything, we got to get on the street, kill us to death, or kill us, shoot us in the streets, or they're going to throw us in prisons in massive numbers like they've done black people and other people of color in the United States.
The next question is from Darren. He says, "Hi Lorenzo, I helped organise your meeting in Edinburgh 20 years ago, and your words then did indeed make a lasting impact on me. It's been a great pleasure to hear you talk again." And he asks, if you have any thoughts on how we can deal with capitalism co-opting the anti-racist struggle. Does it disarm the movement when the bosses are pushing their diversity agenda, giving speeches about Black Lives Matter, etc., while at the same time upholding the structures that maintain race and class oppression, and what we can do?
Well, we're going to have to build a autonomous, I'm not going to call it just left, but an autonomous radical tendency. That's one thing we're going to have to do. That's one thing we want to recognize the necessity of doing if we're going to defeat these people. Because they have always an endless supply of con men and fake radical groups and all this kind of garbage. They got an endless supply of them. And they'll be looked upon favorably. They'll get publicity. They'll get all kinds of stuff, interest that you or someone in your neighborhood fighting for won't get. You know what I'm saying? And so we have to understand that we need to build something autonomous, an autonomous radical movement. You call it left, a new left, whatever you want to call it. I don't care. But we need to build that. And we can't depend on these people that we know are enemy agents, our class sellouts. We can't depend on these people. And this is something that I have found out the hard way, to be quite honest. But because I went through two different, maybe three historical periods, the 1960s and 70s, then the period after in the 80s and 90s and so forth, and then coming up to the current period, having looked at all of this and having understood how they have brought up fake leaders like Jesse Jackson and his campaign to mislead the masses of people. Did you know Jesse Jackson was responsible almost single-handedly for destroying the black movement in that period? We're talking about the 1970s and early, 70s, and before Reagan got in office. He was one of the ones that pushed for the so-called Black Political Summit and all this garbage that was held in both Newark, New Jersey, and in Indiana, Gary, Indiana. And what that was, it was an attempt by the Democratic Party to get more black people back into the fold who had left and were in the streets raising hell. His job was to bring them back in, and he started his campaign, Run Jesse Run, and all this kind of garbage. And so this is how enemy agents work, and he's been followed by others, it's not, the big thing is not to name the individuals, is to talk about the way these things happen, you know what I'm saying? And so we need to form a movement with its direction, its orientation towards the masses of people themselves and against the state and against the political parties and against every form of institution that oppose capitalism. That's what we have to do. And that effectively is what started to happen in the 1960s. There was essentially in 1968, you had a worldwide youth rebellion. And it didn't succeed in terms of destroying capitalism, but one of the realities it did do is destroy liberalism, which was in control of capitalism at that time. And now we have to organize a different kind of movement to defeat fascism and crypto-fascism, all of which covers for capitalism.
The next question we have is from Mikey and Rachel. Do you see any way to get people involved in revolutionary organizations as we revolutionary organizations as we in a UK national anarchist group are finding it difficult to encourage people to quote unquote join or become involved. We are finding lots of quote unquote protests, but no real organizing.
Well, I've always said, and it's just me, and it's not extremely popular at this point, but I've always said that really what I call community-based, or in the States they call it community-based organizing. And even the Black Panther Party, what it effectively was an organization of revolutionary community organizers. And so they went in communities, you know, and in the earlier civil rights period, this is effectively what the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee did. They went into communities and talked to the people, in many cases lived with the people, and so forth, you know, and they were able to raise up a kind of movement that was independent of the establishment. Now, other things happened to undermine that, you know, and that's a story in and of itself. But if we're going to build something, it has to be an independent movement. It has to, you know, people have got to agree and decide on what kind of movement they want to build, and not be influenced by politicians, and not be influenced by what we call in the United States non-profit organizations. One of the things that the establishment did at the end of the 1970s, you know, the Black Power period, they created essentially non-profit organizations of all types, and you know, and many of which were political, you know, get people to join and support the Democratic Party and this, that, and the other. And that's why in the United States right now you have a great many groups under the control of the Democrats, and even the so-called radical tendencies. Many of them are in bed with the Democrats. You know what I'm saying? The Communist Party, you know, they've been in bed with the Democrats for years. I mean, you know, all in all, you've got these kind of things all over the world. I've seen it all over the world, places I've been. And if you could build an independent movement, and if you can link it to poor people, the plight and condition of poor people, and poor people won't trust just anybody because politicians have sold them out, you know. So it's that kind of situation.
We've got a follow-up question from Becca, or sorry, rather Becca's boyfriend. As you've mentioned fascism so much, forgive me, I lost my place. As you mentioned fascism so much, it brings to my mind a quote by Karl Marx that fascism is one of the final forms of capitalism as it begins to die. Based on that, do you get a sense that at all that capitalism is coming to an end?
Well, it's not like fascism it comes up just because capitalism is in crisis. You know, capitalism has been written off so many times by lecturers and radicals and whomever. And of course, it is a stage of capitalism. It's supposed to be a terminal stage of capitalism. But fascism is created to save capitalism using, you know, means of military insurrection and insurrection to save capitalism. It's also designed to, you know, because to be quite honest, it's opposed to any form of democracy, so-called democracy. You know, it's opposed to that. And so the idea that a strong leader and his party would take control of the state, would totally destroy the capitalist structure, supposedly, and would have then the ability to create a new regime. That has been their propaganda line. But in point of fact and in historical accuracy, they're financed by the capitalists. You know, Hitler would not have been able to do all the stuff he did in Russia, or he didn't become the figure he became if it had not been for the capitalists themselves financing him and helping him get in position. Mussolini, now all these guys were already in bed with the state. They had, you know, Mussolini came out of the so-called Socialist Party and became a radical fascist theorist. and organizer. And so we got to understand that, but basically got to understand this. Fascism is corporate capitalism, you know. That's why you read Mussolini's stuff. He talks about it in a different form. He's not talking about the actual, he's talking about in terms of syndicates and all that. And he, you know, but nevertheless, the idea is this. This thing that is created to save fascism. I mean, save capitalism. Fascism is designed to save it. And they'll use means, any means necessary to do it. But it'll differ from country to country, to be quite honest. It'll differ from country to country. Even if you look at, you know, the period of the 1930s, the kind of fascism that arose in Spain didn't follow. I mean, they had a civil war and they wiped out the left, true, but they didn't follow the same logic of Germany that tried for world insurrection and became part of World War II. They didn't do that. And even Mussolini, although he buckled under to Germany, he didn't want to do that because he knew they were likely to be destroyed. But he did it anyway. You know, the United States right now is a different situation. It may bear the same. Well, don't get me talking about this whole similarity and so forth. Just that you asked a question about worldwide, and I think it depends on the nature of the crisis, how deep it actually gets. They are trying to save the system, and some have used it in the past. They try to save the system, you know, by reformist measures. Using fascism as a tool is a way to do it with the cudgel, you know, to beat you down, beat the people down, and make them accept the rule of capitalism, at whatever wages they want you to work, or slave, outright slave, or whatever. They'll use that as a means of social control.
Our next question comes in from a member of the Edinburgh Coalition Against Poverty, and they ask, can you recommend a Black autonomous online news group?
Well, can I recommend a Black autonomous news group? Well, let me put it this way. Black autonomy has been around since 1994. And a lot of this stuff is still up there. I don't know how current it is, but I don't use the organization page anymore. I use my Facebook page to put out what I want to put out. For years, I've been, I guess, the major or main theorist of Black autonomy. There are new groups around. There are several. I don't even know who a lot of them are. There are new Black anarchist formations, and so I can't hardly give you the information about someone else. I can just say, try to find some of the stuff on Black autonomy and stuff that I've written, some of the stuff I've written, and you know, if you can, get on the Facebook page, and I've got material on that. And there's a Black autonomy profile on the web page, you know, that you can go to as well. Unless you're really asking, is there a way you can get in touch with me? And I'll tell you that before I leave here.
The next question is similar to the previous. Beth asks, are there any groups or organizing in the US that you are excited about?
Are there any organized that I'm excited about? Well, I'm excited about reorganizing or rebuilding Black autonomy. I'm excited about the second wave of Black anarchist organizations. I'm not as familiar with them. I'm just now getting to the point I'm making contact with them. But that's what I would tell you, because the potential of those movements is so great. Working together with them, we can change the entire anarchist movement. We can change the entire country, theoretically. Well, more than theoretically. In fact, we could change the whole country, and then have a better presence in the world. So that's what I would tell you. There are other groups around as well. I haven't been in touch with a lot of these groups, although I'm going to start doing it again. Since this is such a crisis, we are facing fascism in the United States, a consolidated fascism. And we have to organize. We have no choice but to organize. We have to organize, or we will essentially die, or even worse. And but I don't see at this point the kind of radical fervent that I saw in the 1960s, where I remember the Black Panther Party coming to existence. I remember making the contacts with them and so forth. And I was astounded with their positions on armed self-defense and beating back police terrorism and so forth. And they were calling for lethal, these measures that would be lethal with the police, off the pigs, man. Armed self-defense. You fire on the police just like you fire on anybody else. And they had a whole, of course, political analysis around that. And so I haven't seen that. I know there's some groups that are marching around with arms and so forth right now, some black organization. I don't know what their politics are. I don't even know if they have any politics. I don't know if they are a group that could be subverted and used for fascism to stifle the people, to crush the people, or if they potentially are a group that could represent a armed resistance to police terrorism and so forth. I will just say that I haven't seen them do anything. I haven't seen them get in front of the masses of people or arm the community, to defend themselves against police terrorism, against vigilante murders, white vigilante murders, or these white supremacist organizations who've been killing black people for quite some time now. I haven't seen them doing anything, none of these groups, to beat back these fascists. Although I will give credit to the Huey P. Newton Gun Club. On one occasion, they did stop some white supremacists from coming into the black community there in Dallas, Texas. But beyond that, I haven't seen anybody getting up and stopping these cops from killing people at random. Just haven't seen it. Black Panther Party used to go and stand there with firearms on their side or on their back, and read from a law book and tell the people that they didn't have to respond to the police. They didn't have to. Police couldn't do this. Police couldn't do that. You know what I'm saying? And the police were frightened of getting in an armed conflict with then and there. So they stopped a lot of this stuff from happening. And in fact, all these killings that are taking place now, all these things start really happening after the Black Panther Party was already made, as part of history. Had dismantled. So bear these things in mind. And we just don't have a radical movement like that. Now, I believe that something's coming. Of course, if I'm still alive, I'm going to help make it happen. I'll say that. Let me take a short trip here, a short break, I should say. I'll be right back.
No worries.
Barry.
Yes, mate.
Is there a lot of other questions to come up?
I've got one more question sitting.
All right, okay.
I think we should maybe say something that this meeting was organised by Action Against Austerity, the network which brings together sort of unwaged groups around Scotland, because I don't think maybe people attending the meeting realised it's the dialogue that we've been helping Andy with Lorenzo that caused this meeting to come about, you know.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think Lorenzo is keen to hear from some of the anti-austerity groups how they organise, albeit in different circumstances.
Right, okay, well, once we get this next question, if I could just come online, and I'll put out the reasoning behind Action Against Austerity in Scotland, if that's okay.
Yes, of course.
Okay, that's what we'll do. We've got another question for you, Lorenzo, and then I'm going to give an outline on how Action Against Austerity came together in Scotland. I think I'll give you a brief summary of what we've done on a message to you in the past, but I would like to outline it to the other people that are perhaps watching this talk with you. Okay?
Yes.
Yeah, no problem.
So the last question we have is from Christopher, and he says, I know defunding the police is a big debate in the USA at the moment. I was wondering if your views on how we can make them more accountable and transparent as long as they are an inseparable part of capitalist society. I have been interested in surveillance and mobile technologies have come into play not only as agents of state surveillance, but also as devices which can be used to record the authorities. In recent years, we have seen public citizens deploying drones, etc.
Is that the question?
Sorry, yeah, that's the question in its entirety.
Well, here we come to the point of figuring out tactics from strategy. And strategy is the overall plan that you're going to employ to defeat whoever it is you're going to defeat. And, you know, and you got strategies, different strategies that groups have employed. You know, it might be the sit-ins, it might be, you know, marches in the street or any number of things. Or it might be armed self-defense. Defunding the police is a measure. Now, I don't know if this is true, but there's many people have been pointing out to me that, in point of fact, the ideas of defunding the police are a measure that was hatched by the Ford Foundation, which is a major capitalist think tank. And they wanted to use it because they didn't want people in the street talking about F the police and so forth and so on. And they didn't want people out there talking about dismantling the police and the state. You know, they didn't want really radical slogans. You know, this, think about this, defunding the police. One is, how are you going to do that? Do you have a political will among those in power to do it? And then the police are not without their own political power base. That's one of the big things to be aware of. They got these major foundations, police foundations they call them, which are financed by the capitalists. They can give money to them and so forth, and they never have to, you know, justify what they've done, giving these funds to them. They also, the police unions, as I talked about before, is really a threat. Now, I don't know how it is in the United Kingdom, to be quite frankly, but in the United States, these police unions, which are claims to be labor unions, these police unions are the entity that actually protects and keeps these murderous cops on a job. You know what I'm saying? They also are the ones who call for and support the most murderous types of police tactics. You know what I'm saying? What we're talking about in the United States in particular is one, paramilitary policing. Paramilitary policing, which came about as a result of the so-called war on drugs. They couldn't do it at the time when the Black Panther Party was in existence, because the Black Panther Party was a popular formation, and they had burrowed their way into the hearts of the people, and that's a fact. I'm not saying that it's some kind of rhetoric. They had actually built a mass base, and this was at a time when there was a new left and there was mass movements against the Vietnam War and all these things. All these things had a tremendous effect on the consciousness of the people. They were not in bed with the cops and the state and all this idea as much as they are now. So that's not a radical demand. That's not a radical demand really at all. It's a kind of demand that you put the struggle that's in the streets in the hands of politicians, in the hands of lawyers and other elements that want to save the state, save the system. You're not dismantling the police. You're not firing all these cops and creating something else. It's just like teaching a new trick to a dog or something, So we're not talking about actual social change, which is different. It's not that at all. And so really we need to rise up against that and critique it and start criticizing that whole ideology.
That's great. Thank you so much, Lorenzo, for all your thoughts. And thanks everyone for all your questions.
So Lorenzo, I'm going to give you a brief resume of what we do as Action Against Austerity, and it's also for the people that are actually.
Sorry, I can't hear
You okay? Okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last.
Right. I'm just going to give you an overall idea about Action Against Austerity that organised this meeting with yourself. It's also for the people that have turned up for this meeting as well. Action Against Austerity was basically set up about 6 or 7 years ago, and it was comprised of various different groups, basically anarchist autonomous groups from all across Scotland. And the common aim that we had was to represent the people in our communities with various issues, particularly welfare and welfare representation, which we call social security, and also for direct action when we've seen injustices through what we would call the Department of Work and Pensions, which would be your welfare organisations, the senior welfare organisations that supply the money. What we also did was work within the communities to help out with what I think you would call a food programme, but we have what we call food banks here. And it was to support them as well in the community through funding and fundraising. I have to say, Lorenzo, that we have a lot of input for the IWW in Scotland, which are really quite good at organising across the board, particularly for technical issues. And actually this Zoom meeting as well has been donated by them for this purpose. But also we've had to join in Dundee the general labour and trade union movement. And it's a sort of a dual-edged sword, if you like, because although we haven't got much time for the official trade union and labour movement, what it does is it gives us a source of income, if you like, that we could disperse at our leisure, which is a really good thing when it comes to working in communities. It saves us for outright fundraising and that, because these trade union and labour movements here in Scotland are really wealthy. And so this is what we have done in Dundee. There's been a lot of community issues that we support in that. And what we tried to do is, for the initial meeting that we had, there was representatives for right across the board, for sort of class war anarchists that would just go about with flags and stuff like that, to people that were really had to learn about how to fight the system by using the system against itself. And there's groups like ECAP and that in Edinburgh that have been really quite successful with this kind of thing. And we're finding more and more in this country, well, particularly in Scotland, that we have other groups popping up with the action against austerity, like the live and rent groups that fight for people for a fair and basic rent for a decent accommodation. So there is quite a lot going on here. And I think when I spoke to you on Messenger, you had said as well that it would be difficult to organize these things in America, because obviously austerity is racialized, and we see it as an open problem here. Right across the board, we say that there's a way that we could tackle this and include in your, it's not right to say services, if you like, it's as in your agitation in the communities, our politics are introduced into that as well. And in that, we have a conflict between our ideas, our agitation, and our general thirst to help our communities develop, that we consistently get resistance, not only for the official government, if you like, but also for the labour and trade union movement, because they're these movements are that corrupt now that all they see is a job for the boys kind of aspect. And so we constantly battle that, because they use it as a bureaucracy against us, and they have done for a long time. And they use it as a bureaucracy and red tape when it comes to real struggle as well. So it's an agreement with what you have already said about you see a black cop or a black prosecutor or that. These trade unionists that are sitting there on these full-time jobs are just the same. They are your enemy, and we hope that, it's unfortunate, I have to say, that a situation like a world pandemic had to turn up for folk to start to realise how corrupt these organisations are right across the board. And it might just be that this pandemic will throw up the real seeds organisation and a real form of revolution for the benefit of the people, our people, that we see as class struggle in this organisation that we do. So that's just a rough, it would take me ages to go through it, because every single group that's involved in action against austerity has a different method of working. But the overall idea, action against austerity, is really good, and it's good for the fact that we've kept it going for so long. So that's just a rough overview on what we do. In every city in Scotland, there is groups that operate, some out with action against austerity, but in a similar fashion. So if people are wanting to join, under the banner of Action Against Austerity, they're quite welcome, and they would easily find out where these groups are in the different cities. So that's a wee update for yourself, Lorenzo. If there's anything you want to ask us on that, I'll try and enlighten you. Okay.
Yeah, it enlightened me. I'm glad that I had the opportunity to speak on here. I mean, groups like yours and really the things we're doing in the United States with Black Autonomy and other groups, we are groups that are situated in organizing poor people and that segment of the labor class that's ignored entirely by the conventional trade unions, just as you said.
Yeah.
And it's been a real, my thing of doing this is to politically educate people who see this and into understanding that, like many people around the world, we are forced at this point to cast aside the old methods of struggle, cast aside the groups that claim to have been radicalized back in the day years ago, and we have to build something new. And we're not always in a position to be heard, but we're going now into a deep class and economic divide. And the ideas that we raise today, and we might be speaking to 50 people, the time is coming where we'll be able to speak to millions in one way or the other. You know what I'm saying? Because the collapse is coming of this system, and we have to take advantage of that. And we also have to recognize that this is the moment. We're literally at the moment when we're going to have a worldwide depression. It's already starting. 61 million, like I said, 61.9 million in the United States are applying for unemployment. And that number is going to increase. And there's people starving to death. I mean, literally starving. They don't have any food. They're being thrown out of their houses and so forth. So people are at a desperate straits. And all the propaganda line of the presidents and the prime ministers and whomever, all that stuff is going to be going out the window, and people are going to look for other alternatives. And I'm not going to say that they're going to just find us, but what's going to happen is that the things we put out there is going to start reaching people, and then people are going to pick up on it, and then they'll start feeling. Then we've been in a position to really influence the outcome of this current historical period. I think that's really important to understand. Otherwise, we can't get to the point where this is politics as usual, or that nothing's going to change. In fact, everything is going to change. And a large part of it is because we're going to change it. And I say we, the class, first, this small organizations like our own right now, we're going to reach a lot of people. People are going to be asking questions, and they're going to test us as well as test the ideas we raise. So we need to understand that this is not in vain, not futile, not just the ravings of an old man, and so forth. But that I put out ideas out there that are starting to be picked up in the United States. That it amazed me, actually. And new groups are coming into existence. And so I've got to reach them just like I'm reaching you tonight. I got to reach these new Black anarchist tendencies. Got to reach other radical tendencies in the United States, and so forth. But it's a worldwide struggle. We can't defeat capitalism in the United States alone. It can't happen.
I think that's a point as well, is that we should have universal solidarity, whereas we could point to things in America and say, well, look at the situation they're in and how they're tackling the struggle. And you could say, well, look at the people in Scotland and how they're tackling the struggle. And then we don't stop there. We go to Greece, or we go to these other countries where we have connections and say, well, this is how they're doing it. And then start combining these ideas and making it stronger and stronger all the time. You can. So
Yeah.
there we go. Wow.
Very good.
So I think, are you tired out now after all this?
Well, I've got to go, unfortunately, and we'll have an opportunity, I hope, to talk again.
Yeah.
And as I said, I hope that something I've said here has some special relevance to some of the people who are listening.
Yeah.
Now, I know I came here 20 years ago, came to Scotland 20 years ago, and spoke. And I was happy to speak to people. I was happy to have the walkabout and so forth. And I was especially happy to meet those radical kids that were in Dundee, and they grabbed me up and they took me on to a speaking place. And they got to the speaking place and they said, the man told them, so you can't speak here, you can't do this. They said, we're hijacking this place.
Well,
So
yeah,
so that's what they did. They effectively hijacked the place. And
the memories are still there. But thanks very much for joining us, Lorenzo. It's been really good to see you again. Very interesting and informative, and I hope you gave maybe something for us as well. But thank you for your time, Lorenzo.
Okay, thank you, guys.
No problem.
Love and struggle. Love and struggle. That's what I always say.
How are you doing, Lucy?
I'm just trying to remember how I retrieved this video thing. I did it kind of semi-automatically the last time, so I'll just stop recording.